Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Texas Podcast. I am your host, Gabe, and today we will be talking about the Anahuac Disturbances. The Anahuac Disturbances were uprisings of settlers in and around Anahuac, Texas in 1832 and 1835, which helped to lay the groundwork for the Texas Revolution. This eventually led to the territory's secession from Mexico and for the founding of the Republic of Texas. Anahuac was located on the east side of the Trinity River near the north shore of Galveston Bay, which placed it astride the trade route between Texas and Louisiana, and from there to the rest of the United States. In new attempts to curtail smuggling and enforce custom tariffs from the coastal settlements, Mexico placed a garrison there after 1830. American settlers came into conflict with Mexican military officers and rose up against them. They increased political activity in residence for numerous communities, and they declared support for the Federalists who were revolting against the Mexican government. After Mexico gained independence from Spain, it legalized immigration from the United States. Empresarios were granted contracts to settle immigrants from the United States and Europe in Mexican Texas. As the number of Mexicans living in Texas increased, Mexican authorities began to fear the United States would want to annex Texas. So on April 6, 1830, the Mexican government passed a series of laws restricting immigration from the United States into Texas. The laws also canceled all unfulfilled empresarial contracts and established custom houses in Texas to enforce the collection of customs duties. Mexican military officer Juan Bradburn, formerly an American citizen who was appointed commander of a new customs and garrison post on Galveston Bay. In October 1830, Bradburn established a post atop a 30-foot bluff at the entrance to the Trinity River. The post became known as Anahuac. Bradburn was unpopular from the beginning of his tenure and with those seeking to expand the Anglo-American presence in Texas. He opposed the efforts of the state land commissioner to grant titles to settlers who lived near Anahuac. The Mexican Constitution of 1824 prohibited immigrants from settling within 26 miles off the coast, and most of these settlers lived too close to the coast. Although the commissioner was finally able to grant the titles, Anglo settlers were angry with Bradburn for enforcing Mexican law. In January 1832, Bradburn received a letter listing 10 men in his jurisdiction who wanted to separate Texas from Mexico. From that point on, Bradburn became very obsessed with the Anglo-Americans and their intentions, believing that every event was part of a conspiracy to detach Texas. In June 1832, two of Bradburn's soldiers attacked an Anglo woman settler. Angry settlers tarred and feathered a neighbor who failed to aid her. They demanded that Bradburn turn over his soldiers for a similar punishment. After Bradburn refused, local men organized a Texan militia company, supposedly to protect the settlements from the Indians. Mexican law forbade residents from creating militias, so Bradburn arrested the ringleader, Patrick Jack. After Bradburn received death threats, he released Jack. Tensions between Bradburn and the colonists escalated. Bradburn strongly supported the Mexican law forbidding slavery, and in August 1831 he gave asylum to 3 men who had escaped slavery in Louisiana. The owner retained local lawyer William Barrett Travis to represent him in trying to get the slaves returned. In May 1832, Bradburn received a letter, ostensibly from a friend, warning that 100 armed men would come from Louisiana to reclaim the slaves. When Bradburn realized that the letter was a hoax, he arrested William Barrett Travis for questioning. He intended to send Travis to Matamoros for a military trial on charges of attempted insurrection to separate the territory from Mexico. Conviction on this charge would lead to Travis's execution. Unfamiliar with Mexican law, the settlers were outraged that Bradburn could arrest the man without a warrant, a statement of charges, or by trial of jury. Most erroneously assumed they were still covered by the United States Bill of Rights. Jack threatened Bradburn, who arrested him again. Travis and Jack then began plotting their escape. They attempted to smuggle letters to David G. Burnett, a fellow instigator, and the letters called on Texans to aid them, but stopped short of callings for armed resistance. Bradburn intercepted the letters before they were able to make their deliveries. Although settlers at first did not get involved, they became alarmed at learning that Bradburn was taking statements from potential witnesses without allowing Travis, Jack, or their legal representations to speak with witnesses. Jack's brother organized a contingent of men to march from Brazoria to Anahuac. Anglos began arriving from the other villages as well. One of the Brazoria councilmen, John Austin, stopped to consult Colonel Domingo de Ugartecha, who commanded the garrison at the Brazos. Ugatecha recommended that Austin request that the men be remanded into civilian custody. Bradburn's officers explained to Austin and company that the laws prohibited turning the accused men over to civilian authorities. The Brazoria men returned home. After they left, the Mexican officers discovered that their horses had been stolen. They arrested 2 local men on suspicion of theft. On hearing of the new arrest, the Brazoria contingent returned to Anahuac. They camped with other angry civilians several miles from Anahuac and elected Frank W. Johnson as commander. The group soon captured Bradburn's 19 cavalry officers who had been trying to reconnoiter the Texan position. On June 10th, the insurgents occupied buildings in northern Anahuac. Bradburn worried that the armed men wanted to do more than free the American prisoners, so he suspected a full-scale revolt. Bradburn had Travis and Jack tied to the ground with weapons pointed at them. Bradburn threatened to shoot both of them if the Texans attacked. Travis encouraged Johnson to lead an attack anyways. During the ensuing negotiations, the Texans offered to exchange the cavalry officers for Travis and the other prisoners. Mexican officers agreed to release their prisoners into civilian custody in exchange for the cavalry officers and for the withdrawal of the Anglos from Turtle Bayou. Although most of the rebels left Anahuac, between 15 and 30 of them remained scattered through the town. Bradburn believed this violated their agreement and warned that he would begin firing on the village within 2 hours. Most of the Texans believed that Bradburn had lied to them just to get them out of the buildings they had occupied. Unbeknownst to the Anglos at the time, the buildings contained extra ammunition and supplies. After hearing Bradburn's warning, the women and children of Anahuac fled the town. Mexican soldiers briefly engaged the men who remained. 5 Mexican soldiers and 1 Texan died in the conflict. After the skirmish, the remaining Texans gathered at Turtle Bayou to await the remaining arrival of cannons coming from Brazoria. On June 5th, the Texans adopted the Turtle Bayou Resolutions. In this document, they announced they were Federalists who supported rebellious Mexican General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. They decried the present dynasty that kept them under military rather than civilian authority. While the Texans waited for their artillery, Bradburn appealed for reinforcements from Colonel Piedras, stationed at Nacogdoches 200 miles north, and Colonel Eslucha at San Antonio, about 300 miles to the west. On June 19th, Piedras and about 100 of his men set out to support Bradburn. John Austin and his men returned to Brazoria for the cannons. On June 20th, he called the residents together, and they voted to oppose the centralist government. Austin invited Colonel Domingo Ugatecha to command the small fort Velasco and the Brazos to join their cause. After Ugatecha refused, on June 26, the Brazoria residents attacked the fort. This action became known as the Battle of Velasco. The next morning, Ugatecha surrendered under an agreement that he and his men would return to Matamoros but leave their artillery behind. When Piedras within 30 miles of Anahuac, he sent a delegation to Johnson, who provided him with a list of grievances against Bradburn. Piedras negotiated a resolution of the conflict. Among the measures to which he agreed were to reestablish the consultation of liberty, to release the civilian prisoners at Anahuac to civilian authorities, and to have Bradburn resign in favor of an officer of his choice. With the Texans' acceptance of the terms on June 28th, Piedras marched to Anahuac on July 1st. Bradburn's chosen successor, Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sabarden, refused to take his place. Piedras took temporary command of the garrison. On July 2nd, he released the prisoners to the civilian authorities. Within a week, they were released with no charges filed. On July 8th, Piedras left for Nacogdoches. He gave command to the Anahuac garrison to Lieutenant Cortina, previously the third in command. 3 days after Piedras left, the bulk of Anahuac troops declared themselves Federalists. The troops were drunk, and Cortina, unable to maintain order, asked Bradburn to resume command. Bradburn refused, instead recommending that Sabarden take responsibility. After an attempt at his assassination was forestalled, Bradburn decided to leave Texas. None of the local ship captains would give him passage. On July 13th, Sabarden announced he would not guarantee the safety of any officers who supported the centralist government. That night, Bradburn left Anahuac. A hired guide took him on foot to Louisiana. Other officers sought sanctuary with sympathetic locals. Historians have discussed Bradburn's role. William C. Davis believes that he overreacted and made heroes of two local malcontents whose actions their own people otherwise had not been much inclined to sanction. The resulting Turtle Bayou resolutions, however, encouraged other Texans to follow similar courses. Many communities declared support for Santa Anna. When Piedras returned to Nacogdoches, he discovered citizens were forming Texan militia companies. He asked the local council to order the militias to disband. They refused and instead formed their own militia. On August 1st, the combined militias ordered Piedras to vow support for the Federalist revolt. When he refused, the Texans attacked and the Battle of Nacogdoches commenced. Several days later, they took Piedras and his men prisoner and convinced them to become Federalists. With the soldiers' surrender and retreat into the Mexican interior, no Mexican troops remained in eastern Texas. This encouraged the colonists to increase political activity. Soon after, they organized the Convention of 1832, which was marking the first attempt to gather Texans from each of the colonies to discuss common goals. A second dispute arose in late January 27, 1835, again over the issue of customs. Leading up to this crisis, a large number of Anglo settlers had immigrated into the Anahuac area. The current commander was reported to be uneasy about the insubordinate attitudes of the locals, and he requested additional military assistance from his superiors. Tensions continued to escalate as some citizens demonstrated with anti-taxation protests and petitions. In addition, a group known as the Citizens of Texas began to meet with the intention of realizing these demands. Andrew Briscoe, a local merchant and boat captain, as well as a member of his group, complained that taxes were not being enforced equally at all ports. He intentionally tested the new commander, Captain Antonio Tenorio, by loading his boat in a way to increase the curiosity of the officials. Briscoe simply loaded his boat with balls. Tenorio was incensed and arrested Briscoe and his partner DeWitt Clinton Harris. The soldiers escorting Harris and Briscoe shot and wounded another Texan, young William Smith. Travis played a major role afterwards. When news of the arrest was heard in San Felipe de Austin, where radical sentiments were taking hold, the political chief Peter Miller authorized Travis to gather a Texan militia company for response. Travis commandeered a vessel at Harrisburg and sailed for Anahuac with the company and a cannon. His 25-man force quickly gained the surrender of more than 40 Mexican troops. After disarming them, Travis and the company freed the Texans and expelled the troops. Because Travis had acted without broad community support, he apologized to avoid endangering Stephen F. Austin, then in Mexico City. Austin was the most prominent impresario under the contract by the Spanish, and later the Mexicans. The Mexican government was to oversee the immigration of people to Mexico's frontier. Later that summer, the Mexican military authorities demanded the surrender of Travis from military trial. The colonists opposed this, and Travis and Austin continued active in Texas development. Travis would later die at the Battle of the Alamo. Austin served as Secretary of State for the Republic of Texas for a short time before his own death in December of 1836. I want to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.